Rebecca Wight and Claudia Brenner set off on a backpacking trip in Pennsylvania on May 12, 1988. And the following evening, the couple was shot in their campsite in a state forest by a man who targeted them because they were gay. Rebecca would not survive the attack, and Claudia's life would be changed radically from that point on. Please join us today as we discuss the murder and attempted murder perpetrated by a hate-filled gunman lurking in the woods. Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In the last 50 years, the U.S. has had nearly 1 million homicides, and since then, over 250,000 cases sit in a box in a basement where all hopes for justice go to die. In 1996, someone shot my uncle Leon Laurelis, changing my life forever and leaving a devastating hole in my heart, and his case remains unsolved. Join me and my wife, Leah, as we shed light on these forgotten victims, their life, the loved ones they left behind, the evidence, and the theories of who committed these crimes, leaving communities in fear and leaving families without answers. Support our effort to change the justice system through the Homicide Families Victims' Rights Act, as we hope to make a difference with our audience as we remember the victims and demand justice. In 1996, my world was shattered when my uncle Leon Laurelis was shot execution-style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and coworkers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention, in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting, collecting dust in a box in a basement. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement Podcast and Justice for Leon Laurelis. And now you can also find us on YouTube.
1988 saw the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 259 passengers and 11 people on the ground. The U.S. Navy mistook an Iranian airliner for a fighter jet and shot it down, killing 290 people. NASA first warned us about the potential dangers of global warming, and George H.W. Bush beat Michael Dukakis for the U.S. presidency. The Washington Redskins beat the Denver Broncos in the Super Bowl, the Edmonton Oilers beat the Boston Bruins in the Stanley Cup Finals, the LA Lakers defeated the Detroit Pistons in the NBA Finals, and the LA Dodgers beat the Oakland Athletics in the World Series, with Kirk Gibson's home run in Game 1 becoming one of the most iconic sports highlights of the 1980s. Terrence Trent D'Arby topped the Billboard Hot 100 with Wishing Well, and Gloria Estefan, Aerosmith, Whitney Houston, and Natalie Cole rounded out the top 5 that week. Highway 101's Cry, Cry, Cry topped the country charts, with Reba McEntire, KT Oslin, and George Strait hot on their heels. Today's story takes place in Pennsylvania near Gettysburg. But instead of talking about a particular city or town, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Appalachian Trail, which is what Rebecca Wight and Claudia Brenner were hiking when they were ambushed. The Appalachian Trail, and we're saying Appalachian on this podcast. Y'all can fight amongst yourselves about how it's quote-unquote supposed to be pronounced, is the longest hiking-only footpath in the world at 2,197.4 miles. Construction began in 1921 and was completed in 1937. It stretches from Mount Katahdin in Maine all the way to Springer Mountain in Georgia and crosses through 14 states, including 229 miles through Pennsylvania. People who hike part or all of the trail typically camp along the path, either out in the open or in tents they bring along, or in any number of shelters built and maintained by volunteers. Because the trail is so long and there are so many entry points, there's no way to accurately estimate how many people are on the trail at any given time. But the best guess is that today, around 3 million people hike part of the trail each year, mostly day hikes or short backpacking trips. The section of the trail that runs through Pennsylvania is quite beautiful, at least from what I can tell in pictures. The section of trail that this couple chose to hike is located in the Michaux State Forest in an area known as Pennsylvania's quote-unquote cradle of forestry, populated by rolling hills full of oak trees.
Rebecca Patricia Wight, known as Becky to her friends, was born on October 17, 1959, in Washington, D.C. Becky's family traveled and moved quite a bit, and she actually graduated from high school in South Korea. Becky loved the outdoors and loved to spend as much of her free time in nature as possible. She was finishing up her MBA at Virginia Tech that spring and had recently been accepted into a PhD program at Penn State. In the free time she didn't spend outdoors, Becky liked to volunteer for various causes, and one in particular stands out. She was a crisis counselor for a crisis hotline in the region. Becky and Claudia met at Virginia Tech about 3 years prior to their attack, and they'd been a couple pretty much ever since. Claudia Brenner was born in Manhattan on June 26, 1956. And in 1988, Claudia was a 31-year-old grad student in architecture. They were both known for being hard-working students, and they were both looking forward to taking a break and enjoying each other's company on a backpacking trip. Though they met in Virginia, a good part of their relationship was spent apart. Claudia's permanent address was in Ithaca, New York, and she'd taken the opportunity to do a study abroad program in Israel earlier that year. So this was an opportunity to reconnect. No distractions, just each other out on the trail. Their plan was to meet up in Pennsylvania, hike Thursday and Friday through the Michaux State Forest, and then meet up with Becky's sister and spend the weekend in D.C. Though neither woman hid the fact that they were gay, they didn't necessarily advertise their relationship. This was the late 1980s. They had slurs yelled at them, all the usual stuff.
Becky and Claudia met up at the Dead Woman's Hollow parking area, and they set off on the trail in the late afternoon. It's important to note that these two were not slouches when it comes to hiking or backpacking. They were experienced and well-equipped, and they'd planned their hike carefully. Becky was the real outdoorsy person, but in later interviews, Claudia says that she loved Becky so much she became an outdoorsy person for her. Anyway, the couple originally planned to spend those 2 nights on the Rocky Knob Trail at the Birch Run Shelter, which today consists of bunks for 8 hikers, and from reviews I've read, it's one of the nicer shelters on the trail. This section of the trail through the state forest has a loop on it, and that's what they were intending to hike. The first night, which was Thursday, May 12th, the couple reached the shelter and began setting up their campsite for the night. Yes, there was an actual cabin at the site, but like I said before, it was a community shelter, and this was a couple who hadn't seen each other in quite a while. They wanted a little more privacy, so they brought along a tent and a double sleeping bag. The couple started a fire, made dinner, and settled into bed. The next morning, believing they had the whole campsite to themselves, Becky and Claudia set about their morning routine and didn't bother to get dressed. They washed their dinner dishes, took a splash bath in the stream running by the campsite, and got prepared for the day's hike. Becky headed to the outhouse near the site's shelter and was surprised by a man who asked her for a cigarette. This man was naked and sporting wood, and it was very apparent that he'd been watching the women go through their morning routine. Becky was startled, obviously, and she told the man that she didn't have any cigarettes and then rushed back to the campsite, totally creeped out by this sudden appearance. Claudia was also unnerved by the incident, so the pair packed up their gear and decided to camp a little farther down the trail, hoping the strange man would leave them alone. Remember, this hike was a loop. The couple was planning to just leave their tent and gear there at the shelter for the duration. As they walked away, they did what women have been conditioned to do for probably forever. They decided to be polite to the strange man, hoping they would get whoever this guy was to leave them alone. They told the man, "See you later," and he said the same in return.
An hour or so later, the couple started to relax and their mood improved. They stopped to take a break, take in the views, and check their map. They reached a fork in the trail, so this was a good time to double check their route and break for water and snacks. That's when they heard the man's voice again, asking if they were lost. This time, the man had a rifle with them. Becky and Claudia responded that they were fine, turned around, and walked as quickly as they could down the trail. By 5:30 that evening, the women felt they'd put enough distance between themselves and the strange man. So they found a nice flat spot off the trail, tucked away in the trees with a stream running nearby. They made dinner and started to settle in for the evening. They put a green tarp in the soft grass, laid down to relax, and started to get intimate. They felt safe enough at this point that they didn't even want to bother with the tent. It was warm and quiet, so they just planned on sleeping on the tarp out in the open. Suddenly, this idyllic, romantic scene became a horror story. Claudia recalled that at first, she couldn't understand what was happening. One second she was kissing her girlfriend, and the next her arm was exploding in blood. It took a few seconds for her brain to register that the loud noises she was hearing were gunshots. The creepy man from the shelter fired a total of 8 times at the couple. Claudia was hit 4 times in the head, face, neck, and arm. Her teeth were shattered, and her arm hung useless at her side. Claudia tried to stay low, hoping that the man wouldn't be able to hit her again. But he fired another shot that caught Claudia on the top of her head. So she's been shot 5 times at this point. Claudia then took off and sought cover behind a tree, assuming Becky was right behind her. She turned around in time to see Becky take 2 rounds, one in the back and one in the neck. The man fired the rifle one last time, but missed. Rebecca managed to drag herself behind the tree with Claudia, and the shooting stopped. The couple were now in a precarious situation. Do you wait longer to make sure the asshole is gone? Or do you risk leaving your cover to get help? Becky was really starting to struggle at this point. It was pretty clear that she was bleeding out and in dire need of medical attention, and Claudia knew she had to get help. She was too injured herself to carry or drag Becky out, So she dressed Becky's wounds as best as she could and reluctantly left her behind and made her way down the trail as quickly as she could. Her injuries made the journey absolutely grueling, and at some point, Claudia had stopped following the trail and just went crashing through the woods in search of some kind of civilization. After about 3 miles, Claudia reached a road where two teenage boys on a joyride gave her a ride to the sheriff's office, which was in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania.
One thing I thought was very interesting here is that Claudia just kept repeating the story of what happened while she was in the car with these two teenagers. This is really smart, actually. She thought she was going to die, and she wanted someone else to have as much information as possible to tell the cops. To have the presence of mind to do that in her condition is pretty amazing.
So Claudia made it to the sheriff's office and handed them a map she'd managed to grab before running into the woods, so they'd have Becky's exact location. First responders rushed to where Claudia left Becky, but it was too late. Becky had succumbed to her injuries. The gunshot wound to Becky's back decimated her liver and would have probably been fatal even if she'd been shot right outside an emergency room, but still. That would be little consolation to Claudia, who felt incredibly guilty for having to leave her behind. Claudia was rushed to the local hospital and then airlifted to Hershey, where there was a trauma center equipped to handle her injuries. Hours of surgery were required to remove the 5 rounds lodged in her body and repair some of the damage that was done. How she was still conscious, let alone able to run through the woods with a hole in her esophagus, is incomprehensible to me.
Pennsylvania State Police descended on the trail and started their investigation, quickly coming across a stash of ammunition, a knife, and a knit hat. It didn't take long for investigators to identify a suspect, 21-year-old Stephen Roy Carr, a drifter who stuck close to that particular area of Pennsylvania and lived part-time in a cave near the crime scene. Stephen Carr was wanted in Florida for grand larceny, so he was just hiding out and avoiding civilization in general. Carr found refuge in a local Mennonite community near where the murder occurred. He thought he was being really sly here. Generally speaking, Mennonites don't watch TV or read newspapers, so he assumed he could hide out indefinitely. However, someone in the community had sneaked some TV time and recognized Carr from a local newscast. This person called the police, and Stephen Carr was arrested on that warrant from Florida. Carr made up a bunch of stories about the shooting. At first, he claimed his rifle and ammo had been stolen, and that he had no idea who shot the women. Then he said he was deer hunting and hit the couple on accident. Eventually, he finally admitted that he shot the 2 women in the woods deliberately. He was charged with first-degree murder, third-degree murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. He waived his right to a jury trial in exchange for the death penalty being removed from consideration. His explanation for his murderous rampage that day was a twist on the gay panic defense. He had witnessed the couple being intimate, and he claimed it led to, quote, inexplicable rage.
And if you aren't familiar with a gay panic defense, it's essentially when the defendant claims that the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity caused a violent reaction. Usually, this happens when a gay man hits on a straight man or a trans woman hits on a straight man, and the recipient of said flirting or other nonviolent, non-aggressive sexual advances murders the person making the move. It's total bullshit, but it's been used successfully for a shocking number of times. It's essentially just a way to try and shift blame to victims.
And Carr tried to double down here as well. He claimed he'd been sexually assaulted while locked up in prison, And he also claimed he'd been molested as a child. This, in combination with seeing the two women he willfully followed and watched start to get intimate, was enough to cause him to want to attack them. Luckily, and surprisingly, the judge on this particular case called bullshit and said that Carr's psychosexual history couldn't be admitted. It's important to note that Claudia was a little hesitant at first to divulge the nature of her relationship with Becky. In 1988, sexual activity between people of the same sex was still illegal in about half of the U.S. states. Luckily, this was not the case in Pennsylvania, but she was still afraid that long-standing biases would poison the justice system against her. Thankfully, that didn't happen here. Claudia testified before the court at Carr's preliminary hearing, and Carr's attorney, Michael George, asked Claudia if she and her girlfriend were teasing Carr or trying to get a rise out of him. Disgusting, right?
And please don't misunderstand us. We know full well that suspects have rights and that everyone has the right to an attorney. It was this guy's job to try and poke holes in Claudia's story, but that doesn't make it any less gross. In interviews after the fact, Michael George admitted freely that he wanted to get the public's opinion on his client's side by vilifying the lesbians. Get the locals talking about the horrors of gay sex, and then maybe he'd have a chance in court or on appeal later on. In any case, Carr eventually agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder if the other charges were dropped and the death penalty was removed from consideration. The attorney immediately filed an appeal, claiming that Carr was quote-unquote provoked by these lesbians getting intimate in the middle of nowhere when they thought nobody was around.
I read in one of our sources that Carr's mother was a closeted lesbian who never wanted him, so that also contributed to his mental state at the time. But again, the court agreed that wasn't a good excuse to try and murder two people in the woods. I realize this happened in 1988 and taking care of your mental health was seen as a weakness or a taboo, but still. If any of you out there today feel inexplicable rage seeing two people of the same sex kiss, please get therapy. I don't care how you were raised or what your religion says, that's not a reason to hurt or murder people. Grow up.
Carr's lawyer tried multiple avenues of approach in this appeal, but the court rejected it, and Michael Carr was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His legal team tried another appeal, but that was also rejected, and Michael Carr, now 65, is rotting in a state prison in Erie, Pennsylvania, where he belongs.
After a lengthy recovery, Claudia Brenner found herself in the spotlight, an unlikely and reluctant torchbearer for gay rights. She quickly learned to embrace her position, however, and wrote a book called 8 Bullets, one woman's story of surviving anti-gay violence. One of Claudia's main points in her continued activism is trying to squash all prejudice against minorities, including the smallest ones. In today's lingo, we call these microaggressions, and this could be as simple as perpetuating harmful tropes and stereotypes, or claiming that it's just too much work to respect someone's pronouns, or something like telling a lesbian they just haven't had sex with the right man yet.
Claudia's efforts also took her to the Pennsylvania state legislature, where she lobbied for harsher penalties for hate crimes. She even took her fight to the federal level as well, also pushing for better accountability in terms of hate crimes.
All of that stuff can create resentment and snowball into more blatant prejudice or even violence down the line. So this case is obviously a little different than most of the ones we cover because it's solved. The perpetrator is behind bars for the rest of his natural life, And the survivor in this case is doing everything in her power to use her experience to improve the lives of others and prevent this same kind of nonsensical violence from happening again.
Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. If you or someone you know is a victim of crime, support is available. Call 855-4-VICTIM to speak with someone who can help you understand your rights and options. Visit victimconnect.org to learn more. We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network, the best in indie podcasts. Check out all the great shows at darkcastnetwork.com.
Hi everyone, I'm Cindy, the host of True Crime California, a weekly podcast about murders and other true crime that takes place in the Great Golden State. Join me every week as I talk about a new case, some very well known and others not so well known, but always coming straight out of California. True Crime California is a proud member of the Darkcast Network.
If you think bringing unsolved cases is important, then please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. Also, please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcasts and Justice for Leon Laurelis. You can now also find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor and subscribe. It would help so much, my lovelies. Also, please share this episode so we can bring awareness to these lesser-known cases so we can reach more people in hopes that someone who may know something will come forward. I'd also like to ask that you sign my petition for my Uncle Leon Laurelis' case to be reopened and reviewed with fresh eyes. And you can find our petition on change.org. This podcast has a bigger purpose than just providing information and entertainment. The Homicide Victims Families Rights Act is a bipartisan bill that was signed into law by Congress in 2021, and we want to see it put into action. This law establishes a systematic process for reviewing case files related to cold case murders. The focus is on providing a mechanism for the families and friends of murder victims to request a formal review of such cases. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators. I also have a GoFundMe page to hire an attorney to help me get a copy of his autopsy that I have been denied for 27 years. You can find the GoFundMe by searching for Leon Laurelis. That's Laureles. But to get his body exhumed, to search for evidence that was not collected the first time around. We and other families and friends need assistance with getting FOIA requests. It blows our minds that so many murders occurred from 1976 to 1997 in Brownwood, Texas, under the watch of the same investigators responsible for handling Leon's case. We're going to look at all the unsolved murders in Brownwood and maybe even a few solved ones if it helps uncover what was happening in that era that left so many families devastated and a community living in fear. If you want to hear more about victim-focused, unsolved cases and get updates about what we know, if you or someone you know is a victim of crime, support is available. Call 855-4-VICTIM to speak with someone who can help you understand your rights and options, confidentially and compassionately. The LGBT National Hotline is 888-843-4564. We will list these resources as well as others in the show notes.